Okay, so hi everyone. My name is Natalia Coles, and I decided to do our final presentation on a book review, or as a book review. And the name of the book is Delusions of Gender, and it is by Cordelia Fine. And then I decided to compare that to Robin Rile's Questioning Gender, a Sociological Exploration, which was our textbook for the semester. So I decided to do this book review, or to do this book review because I thought the book was really interesting. I thought it was well written, and I wanted to sort of find a different viewpoint from the textbook. Um, so within this presentation, I'm just going to be covering some of the points I discussed in my paper, which is what exactly Cordelia Fine, or what is Cordelia Fine's um, a sort of thesis of her book. What exactly is she trying to say, and how does that compare and contrast to what Robin Ryle says in her book? So I decided to make this "What's It All About" little blurb just so for some clarification. So again, I'm going to be talking about what are some of the main points in her book that Fine covers. How does it compare to Ryle's textbook? What does Fine have to say about gender overall, and specs, which is short for speculation? So just what I have to say about the book as a book. How is it written? What type of language is used in the book? What's the tone of the book? Um, and just, is it interesting? Just different things like that. So, excuse me. Beginning in chapter 1, I noticed a lot of similarities between the first chapters within the different books. So the two ladies kind of have the same idea or the same notion, but they tackle it in different ways. So with Robin Ryle's book, or our textbook, chapter 1 is titled Swimming with the Fishes, and she discussed how people see gender. So the first point is we see, therefore we assume. So if you see someone who is acting in a stereotypical female fashion, you're going to assume she is a woman. You get this from her gender attributions, which are very social cues. So if you see her dressing a certain way, she does her makeup, she does her hair, she performs stereotypical female sort of activities, or participates in stereotypical activities, you assume, okay, this is a woman. As this is the same with a man. And then Ryle goes on to discuss the idea of intersectionality, which is how we experience all of our categories at the same time. Excuse me. So just how the different categories that you fit in, how they all impact you and affect how the world sees you. So not only am I a woman, but I'm also a college student. Not only am I a woman and a college student, but I'm also a black woman. So just how do different things like that affect you throughout your life. In Fine's chapter 1, it's titled "We Think, Therefore You Are." And I thought this was really interesting because it really reflects how we project our ideas onto the people around us. And then there was an interesting quote at the beginning of the chapter, which sort of sets the tone for the entire chapter. And the quote was written by Jane Morris, and it pretty much overall discusses how people were projecting their ideas of what a woman should be or how a woman should act onto her. So she found herself becoming exactly what people were talking about. So the quote reads as, "The more I was treated as a woman, the more woman I became. I adapted willy-nilly. If I was assumed to be incompetent at reversing cars or opening bottles, oddly incompetent I found myself becoming. If a case was thought too heavy for me, inexplicably, I found it so myself." So Fine discusses the idea of social stereotypes that someone can project not just onto other people but also onto themselves. Um, so just sort of the idea of what people think about themselves from social stereotypes that other people have about them, if that clears it up. So she discussed the study, and she has a lot of studies throughout her book, but she discussed one of the first studies was by people named Greenwald, Banaji, and Nosek. And it's the idea of putting words onto other people or onto the different sexes So communal words such as, nurturing, giving, different things like that, we tend to think of have to do more with women, while words of agency like aggressive have to do with men. But the study was that they gave people different groups, and they told them to sort of associate those words with different people based on the people that they saw. So they noticed that there was a difficulty in placing agency words onto women. So the idea was that women couldn't necessarily be aggressive, and the idea was that men could not necessarily be nurturing. So I thought this was really interesting, and then I decided to try and connect Ryle's idea of intersectionality with an idea Fine brings up, called associative memory. And what associative memory is, it's that someone does not necessarily tell us something, we sort of see actions and meanings go together, and that's what we associate it with. So how we associate women with being nurturing, then that's where the idea came from. You saw a woman nurture, or a woman nurture you, sort of like your mother, your grandmother. Now you think of women as nurturing, and it sits in the back of your subconscious. So I thought, how would this sort of impact necessarily politics and how we experience everything at the same time? The idea was that because it sits in your subconscious, you do not necessarily know or notice that that's what you're thinking. So let's talk about the idea of feminism, how you could agree with that women are supposed to be equal and you have very progressive political views and ideals. Your associative memory is still sitting in the back of your mind, and it's backtracking on that. And I noticed that even with myself, I consider myself a very avid feminist, but I do notice that in the back of my mind, I do still have these stereotypes about women, about how we're nurturing, about how we're supposed to be at home taking care of the kids and different things like that. So let's move on into another point. So, it got kind of cut off, I'm sorry. But furthering Fine's point with the associative memory, it's conditioning influences behavior. So if you see someone behaving in a certain way that sort of acts like you, it will influence your behavior. But the idea with this is that women were considered to be less than men. And then she connects that into an idea that was done inside of a French high school. Excuse me. So the study was done so that I guess a group of female students and a group of male students were sat down and sort of asked to discuss the different gender stereotypes among the sexes. After doing so, they were asked to recall the results of a standardized test that they took like 2 years prior. The group that had gender stereotypes, they recalled their grades or their marks on that test to be less than what they actually were, because they had the idea that I would not be able to do as well, or that girls were not able to do everything that boys were able to do, so they were not as good in that subject as they actually were. This alters the perception of abilities and self overall. So if you constantly have that conditioning in the back of your mind that you were not able to do something, it will affect your performance. And this even extends into math, which was another study that Fine had in her book, which I thought was more specific. There were two groups of women who were sat down. One was the control group, and they did not discuss any gender stereotypes prior to this, and the other group did. The group that did discuss gender stereotypes performed worse on the math test than the women who did not discuss gender stereotypes. So if you don't think you are less than, it's sort of going to help your ability to do what you want to do. So moving on into our next point. Ryle had a chapter in her book called I Don't Belong Here, and it discusses the idea of female interest in dominated areas. So she discusses how we sort of see different majors as more of a female major or more of a male major, or just sort of the, excuse me, I can't really think of the word right now, but which gender you see in the major more. So we tend to think of English majors as more female, while science-based majors are to be thought of as more male, like engineering and computer sciences. Now, Fine did note in her book that when computer sciences first came out, it was a predominantly female-based field, so men were sort of working in offices and up on higher level floors, while women were sitting down at the computer because that's what they were thought of capable to be doing. Then people like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates came out, and the idea of who belonged in computer sciences began to shift and change. And then the media helped influence that again with movies like Revenge of the Nerds. If you've ever seen it, it's kind of hard to describe, but it's about two geeky or nerdy guys who were very much into computer science and just science overall in general, and they go to college and they sort of get their revenge on the big mean fraternity on campus. And that movie, it has a very much stereotypical male-based cast, while the only time you ever really see women in that movie is when they're being objectified. So imagine having that idea constantly just influencing you, and that's what you're growing up and seeing. You're going to think, well, maybe women can't do computer science. And that's where the idea came from. So next, Fine discusses gender in children, which to me went back to the idea of associative memory, how children see their parents acting growing up and what they see them doing. So that influences him. But what we don't normally think of is how children are influenced by our ideas of gender stereotypes just as much as adults are. And it begins in toddlerhood, so around the time that they're 2 or 3 years old. And you can notice that the female children they take a much more nurturing approach to things like toys than men do. So or that young boys, toddler boys do. So I thought this brought in the idea of nature versus nurture, because you can just be born being more nurturing, but is you watching your parents, does that also have an effect on if you grow up nurturing as well? She also extended this across species, and she brought in Japanese macaque monkeys, which I thought was really interesting and I had never heard of before. So she noticed that they take reversed roles, which means the males take on the much more nurturing or caring role than the females do. And actually the young female monkeys are kept away from infants, just so the male young monkeys can learn their role within the troop. However, these features are different across troops. There are some troops that are not nurturing about their young at all, while there are others that are. So you can have the same species, but just like in people, notice different behaviors. And they also have a primitive sense of sex identity, and Fine questioned why we as humans don't think of sex in the same manner. So she noted that the monkeys are very much into genitalia, and they're very sort of aggressive about it, while we as humans are not. It's more of an academic study. Excuse me, I'm not sure why this keeps getting cut off, but this side is book specs and final thoughts. I really liked this book. I thought it debunked a lot of my ideas and brought up a lot of new points about gender and how it not only affects me, but affects everyone in society, how I project my ideas onto others, and possibly how others project their idea onto me. She uses a lot of simple language in this book. It was completely easy to understand. She explains everything in good detail, but it does read like a case study. However, I do recommend it. So overall, that was it. That's all I have to say. And good luck on finals. Bye.